Good afternoon again. We have hosted these AFI conversation platforms for a year now. And with this platform, we hope to highlight the far-reaching positive impact that the creative industry has on the continent in terms of our economy, in terms of our culture, and the creativity that our vast continent has. We would like to share ideas, share knowledge, innovate together, and we want to invite investments into the space, and we want to invite the public to participate in the growth of a very strong made in Africa product. With each of the discussions that we've had in the past, we have evolved, and we realized that each of the discussions, whether it was talking about the global trends relating to sustainability, digital transformation, these topics are all interrelated. And we hope that with Africa's access to technology and our willingness to will the world, to lead the world in sustainable practices, we will be able to position the African textile sector, the African manufacturing, the clothing sector on the whole as a major player globally. We're living in the era of coronavirus, and that's why you see each of our panel members wearing their beautifully made masks. At the same time, we also realize that we have not really come together to discuss how we're going to collaborate as a sector, particularly the African textile sector, in leveraging the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which was supposed to have come into effect on the 1st of July this year. And as I hand over to Dr. Frannie, who is going to facilitate this session for us, I'd like to say thank you to each one of our panel members. And I'd like to say thank you to the audience that is joining us today. We look forward to a very, very insightful discussion. And please send your questions as you wish. Thank you. Over to you,
Thank you very much, Dr. Precious, and beautiful headset and mask. It really is well coordinated and features African textiles very well. We have a fantastic panel to join us today in elaborating and going in detail in this question, and I'll introduce them in the order that I see them on my screen. So I will start with Nicole Moonsamy. She is a superwoman working at IDC and has been actively involved in the pre-funding, deal structuring, and post-investment activities in numerous sectors. But today, we're particularly asking her to talk about her 11 years of experience in the expansion of the clothing, textiles, footwear, and leather sector. Then we have Mr. Kelvyn Breetzke, who is the managing director of Gama Textiles. And he also brings a wealth of experience in the South African textile industry since 1992. He has held other positions, including general manager at BKB, and we really are looking forward to learning from him today. We have Dr. Vuyo Mahlati. She is a social entrepreneur and a founder of a brand that you may know, Ivili Loboya Wool and Cashmere Processing Plant in Eastern Cape. This is an award-winning clothing and textiles manufacturing plant which produces a brand called Dedani Collection, and it's a luxury brand with blended natural fibers, and that's her fashion label. But beyond that, of course, she's been exposed to this sector for many years and brings a wealth of experience. She also is the president of the African Farmers Association. And last but not least, we have Gillian Pias. She's a partner at McKinsey in the Nairobi office and has been with McKinsey for 12 years. I've heard Gillian speak extensively on manufacturing issues in general, but particularly in East Africa and Africa. And she has worked also in the textile and apparel sector and supports the DFID Manufacturing Africa program in East Africa. So they will be joining me today, and you'll pardon me moving back and forth because we are sharing screens in terms of the work we are going to be doing today. I would like maybe to give a few introductory remarks to support what Dr. Precious has just very eloquently said. Because we have this coronavirus pandemic, it has resulted in store closures, restrictions in movement of people, but also of goods. And this has put a major dent in sales of all sorts of products, but particularly in the textile and garment sector. The virus has also had a very serious impact behind the scenes because it has disrupted global supply chains and trade flows. And when you look at the fashion, textiles, and garment sector, there are major challenges now, particularly as countries need those inputs in order to develop and produce protective equipment, PPE. So the COVID-19 surge and the challenge that it has brought, particularly to Africa, means that we have to find a way to meet the demand and the shortages of PPE, and that is compelling countries to look inward and look at how they can invest and prop up and support the manufacturing sector, and particularly the textile and garment sector. So the Africa textile industry is very diverse, but it is quite small when you compare it, say, to India or other countries, including China, where their textile sector directly employs up to 35 million people. And for Africa, those numbers are also quite large. They are around that figure, but also if you count the informal sector, it's a bit higher. But despite this, analysts are predicting that Africa has a competitive advantage in the production of textiles. We grow the cotton here and many other fibers, and so that's an advantage. So ultimately, the rise of African patents in the global fashion landscape could prove to be advantageous if African textiles and garments could be produced and gain traction in international markets. So with those opening remarks, let me just set the stage for our dialogue this morning. We'll talk about 3 blocks of themes. First, what is the state of the Africa textile sector? What has been the impact of coronavirus? And then where are the opportunities in the African continental free trade area? And what are we doing to take advantage of those opportunities? So to kick off the conversation, I'm going to ask Dr. Vuyo to lead the first question. Basically, Dr. Vuyo, we are still on the continent a very minor player in the global fashion market, and we are valued really a lot for primary inputs like cotton, wool, and other raw materials. But as your company itself has shown, we can do different. So maybe I'd ask you more on the constraint side. What, in your view, has prevented the growth of value-added supply chains on the continent in the last decade? Dr. Vuyo?
Thank you so much, Dr. Frannie, for that introduction. And thanks again to Dr. Precious Moloi-Motsepe and the AFI for the conversations, which I appreciate. And they're also wonderful to speak here with the esteemed panelists. I think quickly, we really are sitting at a time where we are faced with great opportunities, particularly in the area of clothing and textile within our continent. As you say, we've got the raw material for production. We've had cotton for quite some time. We have other natural fibers, which we continue to discover and begin to commercialize, as far as wood from both plant and animal fibers. But the critical issue relates to the structure of those supply chains and the infrastructure that is required for people to work across, the various levels as far as the value chains are concerned. And in my opinion, there are 3 critical themes that require intense attention. One is the fact that the sector is still dualistic across the board. Particularly in our country, in South Africa. You've got the formal sector, and then you've got the informal sector. And it has become very difficult to address these structural issues. And in our country, it becomes more with the racial tensions that we continue to experience. And in other parts of the continent, we are grappling with an economy that's economies that are struggling to modernize and be able to invest in the critical areas that we require. So the other issue relates to access to funding. And the problem of access to funding cuts across because the sector is evolving. We have experienced in the continent the issue of, generally the dwindling of the sector with the Chinese, coming in big time globally and massifying the whole clothing industry, taking over in different parts of the world. But I believe that we are in a great space right now because things have changed for different reasons. And at the same time, the challenge is that with the shifts that we are beginning to see, we are also still in danger because the locals have not strengthened in a way that they can take advantage of the opportunities of the value chains because they're still not structured properly. And what that does is to open spaces again for people coming from other areas to re-establish here. So what we need to do is to push, first and foremost, the structural shifts that are required within the sector, the innovations, because technology has provided that, but at the same time, we need to find the right mechanisms for skilling and innovation that is building on what exists. Because lastly, I want to say, this is a great sector in our continent in the sense that it was developed before it was formalized. And in a sense, now we are seeing an environment where the creativity, which is indigenous, is something that the world is sought after, is pushing for. And we are having young people who are designers across the value chain, who are participating in introducing new innovations, but are not getting the critical support. But we are known for very strong brands, starting with the likes of the Shweshwes and others. But the issue is to make sure that we build on those, but focus more on the emerging innovations and the natural resources and fibers that we need to harness in order to get the best out of what we have.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Vuyo. I'm going to ask Kelvyn now. The African textile sector cannot be viewed as a single sector. So are there regions that offer examples of best practice where we can learn from?
Thank you, Frannie. I think it's a very good question. Obviously, the textile sector in South Africa over the last several years has shown a massive decrease in numbers, and there's been lots of down. So the one area that I think is of a lot of product moving offshore has been the three-catch Shweshwe product manufactured at Gama Textiles. And those people that know it will identify it as three cats. It's probably one of the oldest brands in South Africa. And the reason I believe it has been successful is firstly because there's an integrated regional supply base. The cotton is grown, raw cotton is grown in Malawi and Zimbabwe and South Africa, really good quality cotton. And that cotton is purchased by the spinners, and we have spinners in Natal in South Africa. We have spinners in Lesotho. They spin that yarn, and then the yarn is transported down to our processing plant in King Williamstown at the Gama Textiles, and we weave and we dye and we print that fabric using techniques and designs that have been used for literally hundreds of years, and the product is then distributed by a company called Kawi Trading. And our Kawi Trading at any one time have 850 designs of Shweshwe in stock. And within a week, they will deliver the stock to retailers and wholesalers throughout the region, Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, Swaziland. And that fabric is delivered in such a way that the retailers really only have to carry a week or 2 weeks stock, because it's enabled them to top it up with their cash flow, and at the same time giving their customers a wide range of products to choose from. So it's a fantastic turnaround. The dressmakers, designers, purchase fabric mainly on a Monday. It's really interesting. On a Monday, a retail shop selling shwe is at its busiest. The retailers tell us that on a Monday, the designers and the dressmakers come into the shop, they select their designs, and during the week, they make shwe garments, which are sold in the informal sector over the weekends, hawked, and then the process is continued the following week. Now, Rhodes University recently did a study, and they estimate that between 13 and 15,000 dressmakers buy shwe fabrics on manufacture shwe on a monthly basis, and they derive their livelihood from those garments. So it's an enormous amount of people down the line that are selling garments. The other reason why I believe that this pipeline has been successful is obviously because of the strong brand identity, and also the use of informal retailers as opposed to the traditional chains. Now, the chains obviously buy in bulk, and a lot of the garments are bought in as opposed to making locally. And a lot of the chains garments, as we know, over the many years have moved across to China and to Bangladesh and to other cheaper manufacturers. But this particular product has managed to grow because of the huge design, the specific design and the identification to the brand and the availability, the excellent service levels that everybody in the pipeline is getting allows them to make a return. Each person in that pipeline is allowed to make a profit. And as long as everybody's making a profit, alternatives and imitations are not required. So, despite a lot of products reducing in volumes in South Africa, this is the one product which year on year has shown growth. More people are using it, and the final and a very important aspect to the success of this product has been the fashion industry, because the fashion industry have come with innovation. They have, initially there were 3 colors in shwe, now there are a multitude of colors. It was only used specifically for ladies' dresses. Now you can buy shwe slippers, and you can buy shwe handbags and masks, etc., etc. So they give new ideas, and those ideas are then utilized by the ladies on the ground or the seamstresses and designers, and they interpret them, and we see them at weddings and at social events. And so I really believe that there are several other ethnic fabrics around Africa, and a similar distribution pipeline where all the role players along the line are able to make money will despite despite prices and opportunities from imports. This is the one product, because of a brand and because of the distribution and because of the way that people are able to sell, has remained successful. Thank you.
Great, thank you for those examples. So I'll turn now to Nicole, and Kelvyn has mentioned a number of areas of benefit that come from the textile sector. When you look at the manufacturing sector in particular, where do you see opportunities for economic and social benefits? And particularly, how can those opportunities be given value? And maybe if you can respond also on the question of competitiveness, given the international trading environment, what do you see as opportunities for Africa to compete?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Frannie, and thank you to my previous speakers who have set a very interesting platform for me to speak. One of the challenges, or not a challenge, one of the reasons that I'm so closely connected to the sector is for the very question you've raised, is because of the impact that clothing, textiles, footwear, leather, and accessories can have on us as a society, us as an economy. We always look at what is the best way for Africa to become the next big powerhouse. We have all the natural resources, we have all the human capital. And the one thing that we just lack is the motivation to drive and to push this further. If I look at what Dr. Vuyo mentioned, she said that our textile sector, our clothing sector was developed long before it was formalized. So we have a natural ability to succeed within the sector. And what that stems from is the need that everybody possesses to be clothed, to have a nice house with good furnishings, to have shoes on our feet, to look presentable and stylish, whether we're wearing COVID masks or going to a wedding. We all have an aspiration to be dressed and attired well. And this is the social benefit that clothing and textiles brings. It allows us to develop our creativity into a skill. It doesn't take a lot to become a good seamstress. You don't need an extensive degree. And that's the benefit that we as Africa can extrapolate from this. We look at regional beneficiation, where we see that we can grow cotton very successfully in one country, and gin it and spin it in another country, and then move it down into textiles like we do with the Gama. And that's the benefit of this sector for Africa, both regionally, if we look at the different free trade, regional trade agreements that are in place, but also if we expand this across the continent, the opportunities are endless. We do have some challenges in that one of the things that I do think that we as a continent need to beef up on is our porous borders. It is a reality that we are seen as, and I use the term in inverted commas, a dumping ground for whether it be secondhand clothing or excess fabrics, but that is something we need to contain. If we can secure our borders, that is the one thing that we can do to strengthen the manufacturing capacity within the country, and also create that downward value chain where if we can create our fabrics locally, we can then create the smaller cut, make and trim operations that sew our clothing and our shoes and our accessories. And it also gives us opportunity then to grow our design base, because we are then creating for ourselves.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Gillian, I'm going to start off with a message that has come in from our participants and then go into the question that I was going to ask you. So a participant has said that it's very well known that Italy has been one of the most hard-hit countries during the current unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic, and that Giorgio Armani, the online page, explained the effects of this crisis in the fashion industry worldwide, and mostly for the Armani luxury brand, and noted that all Italian production plants have temporarily switched to the manufacturing of single-use medical overalls to be used by the individuals for protection of healthcare workers against the COVID-19. And so the question there, and I'll link it to what I was going to ask you anyway, is that this participant wants to dedicate a special thought to those involved in the production of disposable medical overalls with their skills and dedication, and wanted to ask how is the African textile and manufacturing industry positioned to emulate that transformation in order to keep jobs. But at the same time, if you could speak more broadly about how ready Africa is to take on this textile and garment manufacturing sector. Gillian?
Well, thank you, Frannie, and thank you for the pop question as well on PPE in Africa. I'm more than happy to talk about that. Maybe if I can start with the bigger picture and then go to the question of PPE, which is personal protective equipment, as the audience member has asked. So I'm going to take a little bit more of a macro view on where Africa fits in all of this. McKinsey runs an annual survey with chief purchasing officers of all the major apparel and fashion houses globally every year. And one of the things we've noticed over the course of years is a huge push from CPOs to diversify away from China as a sourcing destination because of single sourcing risk. And certainly our belief is COVID has actually emphasized that, because when China was hit, it of course disrupted their supply chains immediately. And so Africa does show up as an area or a continent of interest more and more for buyers in terms of where they can source textiles and apparel. But also the resounding thing we hear every time, though, is cost matters. And this is a hugely cost competitive industry. I see Nicole nodding her head, and certainly from an international perspective, the buyers all want cost to be there. So if you think about how we position ourselves in that dynamic, textiles on a commercial scale really require a lot of electricity, a lot of water, a lot of high quality or good quality cotton. And the countries that actually have good structures or cost structures against those dimensions succeed quite well. And this is, for example, the reason that Ethiopia appears as a top sourcing destination for many buyers, because it has electricity at 3 cents per kilowatt hour. Contrast that with Kenya, where it's 13 cents per kilowatt hour for commercial use. They have industrial parks where they've set up the infrastructure, including the water connection, and a huge drive around cotton production locally of good quality cotton. And again, we contrast that with the neighboring country I live in, Kenya, where we have somewhat of the opposite situation, and hence Kenya has somewhat fallen down in terms of textiles, although not apparel, right? And so I think it is important for countries and regions to consider how they are playing in the cost competitive dynamic. And of course, later in this conversation, we'll talk more about actually domestic and regional market. But if we are talking international market, that matters a lot. And the countries that put in the incentive structures like Ethiopia are attracting that investment from Chinese players, Indian players, and others. Now, PPE is an excellent question, and many manufacturers of apparel who have large workforces, for example, in Kenya, have really looked at whether they can switch a lot of their production towards PPE. And I'll say 2 things here. One is the manufacturing of scrubs, which are essentially the protective gowns and the foot covers, is completely doable in Africa. And there are actually players already in Kenya and in Ghana who do produce those already and actually have produced them for export for many, many years. And I think the emphasis needs to be with our country governments and our sectors to actually encourage scale up of those players who have that expertise more and more, right? And potentially dissemination of that expertise to other players. The second thing I'll say here, though, is that there's something of an odd supply-demand mismatch that is happening. As McKinsey, we also work quite a bit with ministries of health on the continent in the context of COVID. And certainly we know ministries of health here will need significant amounts of PPE, considering that we are nowhere near the peak, unfortunately, of COVID in Africa. And yet you do not yet see governments and industry coming together to say, how much do I actually need? How much can you produce? Let's figure out how to make this work. So we have a bit of a supply-demand mismatch where I think it has to do somewhat with public procurement, not necessarily communication direct with industry between ministries of health and the industry, because normally that's not a discussion that happens. I will say the other part of the confusion here is around masks versus scrubs and footwear, where certainly surgical masks require certain materials that are unfortunately not available anywhere globally at this point beyond in their point of origin, which is really like China and Turkey, a few places that actually make that material. It's on a massive backlog. And so there's also a lot of noise in the system where ministries of health are hearing some people claim that they can make masks, but actually they can't make surgical masks. And so we have a little bit of a disconnect as an industry on what we can actually do, what the demand is that we can fulfill, what the demand is that we can't fulfill. I think it behooves us as an industry to actually create more clarity between ministries of health and ourselves around where we can actually fit in this picture, because certainly we have the workforce and we have the capability to make certain forms of PPE at scale on this continent.
Thank you very much, Gillian. So with the response that Gillian has given, it has moved us now to the second theme of our dialogue today, which is on the impact of coronavirus. So I'd like to ask Nicole, reliance on international trade partners has proven risky during this global pandemic. So how prepared was the African textile industry for these unprecedented disruptions?
Thanks, Dr. Frannie. I think it's safe to say that Africa, like the rest of the world, was caught completely off guard. The difference between Africa and the rest of the world is that we are resilient. We've been through tough times, we've been through difficult times, not necessarily maybe of the scale of a global pandemic, but we have the ability to research. And the one thing that has helped us significantly is that for a great amount of our natural fibers that goes into our textiles, it's all locally grown in Africa. Gillian also just mentioned about the quality of cotton that comes out of Ethiopia. That is one of the benefits that we as a continent have, is that we aren't 100% reliant for our input materials on countries outside of our continent. And this is the one area that I think we have the upper hand with the rest of the world, because if we look at ourselves as a chain of manufacturers throughout the continent, we are effectively self-sustaining. So were we prepared? I don't think so. But can we take advantage of it and bounce back and use our resilience? I am completely convinced that Africa is ready to monopolize on the breakdown in the global supply chain.
Great, thank you for that. I'll turn now to Dr. Vuyo, and I'll also combine with a comment or question that has come from our participants. So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Vuyo, you have successfully built a business from the ground, and you're using African-based textiles and manufacturing garments within factories in Africa. There's a question from the audience about Mozambique, saying in Mozambique, there are legacy factories and equipment from many years back that are in various stages of disrepair. How would you advise a country like Mozambique, based on your experience, to actually jumpstart and go into delivering a high brand like the one you've been able to do? Dr. Vuyo?
Thank you so much, and thanks for the question. I think that, you know, I'm very lucky because I had a stint. I worked a bit in Mozambique, focusing on rural economies. And Mozambique is one of the most amazing, within Southern Africa or in Africa, areas with such great talent and innovation. And also where people do so much with so little, obviously following all the wars and the whole process of reconstruction that they've gone through. And I think my experience of establishing a factory in a similar place called Butterworth, Ibiga village, which was a hub of clothing and textiles before, but all that collapsed. When we had to start our factory, we had to renovate from scratch. And in a sense, and unlike other areas of our country, where you have, you know, your special economic zones or industrial development zones, you have the support. There you had to do that on your own. So I believe that it is possible wherever we are. You have to have the will and find the right people to work with. We started the business as a family business. I was on my own. I was not getting any support. I went to the IDCs. They unfortunately didn't help me. I still don't have the grant from DTI for Black industrialists, but we were very lucky because we focused our research with CSIR, had an incubation process, and also focused on the market. We had our customers, our first customer, for instance, and that's very important because you have to have that customer. And I always, and we started in the footwear, where we are supplying still today to supplying wool that we process for insoles of shoes. And these are safety shoes for industry. And they make over 1 million shoes a year and employ over 1,000 people in the industry that we supply. And it's so critical to have that because it was through the private sector relation of having a market that we managed to do that. And what assisted as well is that when we shifted to the clothing side, we were very lucky in the sense that the clothing side was cross-subsidized by the other business. But where we are now, as far as that is concerned, and I'm talking now on the shoe manufacturing side for the insoles, is that we have managed to localize the supply. They were sourcing this from outside South Africa. Now they are sourcing it from us. Well, I'm very happy to share directly with the people of Mozambique because I believe it is possible to revive areas that were there. We did it, and it's possible. Now we're getting into other areas if I'm talking, we're a clothing and we are a wool and cashmere processor, and we've got a full processing plant within the Kashmir and the very first within the African continent. So it's tough, but possible.
Thank you, Dr. Vuyo. So Kelvyn, I'll turn to you now on the question of attitudes. Do you see actors in the textile value chain taking this opportunity during the crisis to shift local attitudes towards made in Africa? Are you seeing any of that?
Most certainly, we've seen the green shoots of attitude shift, and I think it's mainly due to the fact that a lot of companies have had a single source strategy. I know Gillian alluded to it early on, but certainly a single source strategy when you're faced with a lockdown is majorly disruptive, and in fact you can't trade. So I think a lot of companies, certainly locally, are looking to split risk, and that's initially. With the requirements, certainly for the masks and some of for the scrubs and the hospital sheeting, et cetera, which is directly related to COVID-19, a lot of the customers or companies that were sourcing offshore have now looking to source some of that volume locally, and that's obviously an opportunity for us to be able to deliver to them a quality product, which allows them to give us continuity of supply going forward post COVID-19, and also allows the local industry some form of volume where the other markets have fallen away. So certainly there has been a shift, and the reality with lockdown is that your fixed overheads don't lock down; the fixed overheads continue. So everybody needs production for sustainability. So everybody in the pipeline is looking to help each other, and I think there's been certainly a working together. I'm on several WhatsApp groups where guys that were opposition before are sharing ideas, helping people find sources of supply. Certainly on the non-woven side, filtration for the masks, and there's been a lot of sharing and a lot of changing of attitude, and it maybe speaks to the resilience that Nicole alluded to as well, where we're trying to work together to solve an African crisis.
All right, so Kelvyn, with your response, you've taken us now to the third theme of our dialogue, which is the opportunities in Africa's continental free trade area. So I'll start with Gillian. When you look at what the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development has estimated, it shows that Africa in the recent years had exports, intra-African exports of about 17%, compared to Europe, which is almost at 70%. So as it stands currently, do you think there is capacity and demand to grow intra-African trade? And if yes, can the textile sector be one of the sectors to do so? Gillian? Nicole. Nicole.
Well, I'd be happy if Gillian took it, but I'm glad to give my view as well. I believe that there is capacity and there should be a demand. I think it links quite, like you said, I mean, it segued quite easily from what Kelvyn just spoke about, is that when we look at how we're going to come back from this crisis, it requires a collective effort. Africa has got many regional trade agreements. However, the minute you try and trade in between those regions, we seem to get lost in red tape or in confusion. And I think what we need to start doing is working cohesively together. We need to take advantage of every country or every region's best practices and best skill sets. And that's how we're going to drive the demand and increase the capacity throughout the continent. Yes, there are going to be challenges that have been alluded to historically, previously. We look at infrastructure, we look at financing, and I note Dr. Vuyo's comment on the IDC, but I will park it. And all of those things are the realities in which we as a textile sector need to work together and work to a greater good to try and develop. A continental effort is required. The demand is always going to be there. One of the things that we do need to drive is a responsible purchaser of apparel and footwear. We as African citizens need to start being more conscientious in how we purchase, and not only buying things that appear to look like they're from Africa, but actually look at the labels and be conscious in how we deal with our purchasing, what we do with our purchasing power. If we can change our consumer behavior, we are inherently creating a demand for African-made goods, not just African print, but we need to develop a capacity that extends beyond fashion. Fashion is a driver of emotion, and it drives what Africa stands for. But we need to look at, are we purchasing African-made, just normal workwear? We alluded to government procurement and those kind of preferential procurement policies that we need to start engaging in as an African continent. And I believe that those are the areas that will drive the success of the African Free Trade Agreement.
Great. So Gillian, I'm coming now to you with the research and advisory work you've done at McKinsey, which is very, very interesting on the opportunities. It has been estimated that the quality and the high cost of infrastructure services are big constraints to productivity, up to a 40% impact each year. And there's also an annual financing gap, which both Dr. Precious and Dr. Vuyo mentioned. So do the textiles and garment sector in Africa have a value proposition that is attractive to investors? And if yes, do you see opportunities for growth in attracting investors to this sector? Gillian?
Great question. And I'll actually build on a lot of what Nicole just said in terms of how we can think about the path forward. I think investors follow the demand a lot of the time, right? They want to see where is the demand. And if I think about demand in two ways, right? The international demand for African textiles and then the African demand for African textiles, I think we need to figure out how as a continent we position ourselves in those two areas, right? And on the first one, in international demand, while I talked a lot about cost right off the bat, I think we should also recognize there is a significant push in the fashion industry for sustainability globally as well, with 56% of the CPOs we surveyed saying this is going to be one of their #1 topics. And what is the role that Africa can play in sustainable fashion, right, through Better Cotton Initiative or even fair trade, other things that we can position ourselves to do to become sort of the hub for sustainable fashion. And that's I think an interesting question I'd love to hear people who are on the call talk about as well. And then when we think about Africa demand, right, it's so interesting when I look at the large-scale commercial textile players that I've worked with. They are just structurally set up for export, right? In fact, many of them are under regulation where they can't sell more than 5 to 10% of their production locally because they are set up for export and they get export credits to do that. And so selling domestically is a negative, right? And I think we need to rethink how we get our established players to also focus on developing local demand. And that includes many of the things Nicole mentioned around changing how our consumers behave, also thinking about what kind of price point we can offer in the market relative, because we are facing competition from Chinese production, from secondhand clothing, also potentially relooking at that regulation that is allowing some of those, let's say, lower cost or secondhand clothes to come into our markets and flood our markets. If I can be somewhat controversial in that, or maybe not controversial in this dimension. And I think when we think about Africa free trade, I think it'll help with a lot of the infrastructural things that you brought up, Frannie, but I think we also have to really think about how are we going to create that market and that demand for our own products, and what can we as local players do to promote change in consumer behavior locally in order to create that demand. And I think the investment will follow that.
All right, that's an excellent segue also to the question I wanted to ask Kelvyn. Gillian has raised this point that we need to create the market and demand. So when you look at where we are today, are there ways to ensure that investments made in the sector are able to build global competitiveness? And when you look at the different sectors, what resources and skills are available in different regions of Africa to be able to actually build that global competitiveness? Kelvyn?
I think that's a good follow on. I think certainly a beneficiation for me would be the starting point. We have raw materials, we have fantastic wool and cotton we mentioned a number of times. I think we need to look at best practices internationally. If we look at countries like Pakistan and China from a textile perspective, they both have encompassed volume throughput and specialization to the nth degree. So Pakistan are very strong growers of cotton, and they're fantastic spinners and weavers. And, you know, they export a lot of grayish fabric which is not processed down the line, dyeing and printing and finishing. So I believe that there's opportunities within the African continent, that there are areas close to growth of the cotton, the actual product. Those are the areas where one should consider the gins and the spinning and the weaving of the grayish fabric. And absolutely South Africa as a consumer as opposed to an exporter. That's where I think in every region we have ethnic and traditional textiles, printed fabrics. I've been in China to several massive printing textile manufacturers, and all they do is print millions and millions of meters of traditional textiles that come to East and West Africa, you know, on a monthly, daily basis. Containers arrive. The market is here. There is already a market. We understand, Africans surely understand the printing and the design and the handwriting of their own local fabric better than the fabric that's been knocked off in China. I believe that with this trade agreement, there are substantial duties in a number of countries. In Nigeria, for example, there's huge duties of export of ethnic fabrics from abroad, and maybe there's a chance that with a regional view and in areas of expertise, areas where spinning and weaving can take place, like the Pakistani areas where printing is a speciality. I mean, printing is a wonderful skill, and we need to save that skill that we have left. Printing more textiles with a handwriting of the various countries and the requirements, and then selling it amongst Africa. Just the cotton, the raw cotton, market would be enough to certainly vitalize and employ thousands and thousands of people across the continent, which Africans themselves are utilizing. You know, it's not like we already are a consumer of those products daily and weekly and monthly. We want to try and make a bigger percentage. If 5 or 10% of the product that is worn is made locally in that segment, imagine if it was 20 or 30 or 40%, what the immediate spin-off would be. And I think that should be the focus, is let's target a market area. Let's target areas of expertise where we grow. Let's not export all our raw material, not export all our wool. Let's make more of the product locally, and let's add value. I mean, there's other opportunities of new products, you know, like hemp. Hemp may well be a product of the future, and, you know, there's opportunities of growing hemp locally.
Great. So we have about maybe 4-6 minutes left. So I'll ask you to start formulating your closing remarks. I'll start with Dr. Vuyo with a question from the audience. And if you could then just make your closing remarks on that. So someone has asked, saying that at the moment, she's a part owner of a company, and they focus on school offering basic garments, and they're also making masks. And her main question is that there's a lot of imitation, and that everywhere you go now you find masks and scarves. So I think it's also a question around branding and the uniqueness. So the question she has is, how do you boost morale of students and find a bigger market to sell unique pieces? You have succeeded in selling unique pieces. So do you have advice for this participant? And if you could also use this response to formulate your closing remarks, and you have 2 minutes for those. Thank you, Dr.
Well, questions for 2 minutes. Thanks, Dr. Frannie. I think the critical thing is to know your product and know your client. Because if you're doing what other people are doing, then you find yourself in a difficult situation. It's not easy, but the sooner you discipline yourself to do that, the better. We are also in the mask space. There are so many people, because from our side, we manufacture the fabric first and then, you know, produce the masks. And we know the clients that we're targeting. And it becomes easier because you don't go to everybody. You specifically target. So I think that's very, very important. And also it links to your costs, because you need to know your cost of production and the kind of a person who can afford that and how you deal with that. It's easy to say, but it takes time, but it's possible. Once you are clear who you're dealing with, it continues. But I think and also the motivation of the students, it's always motivating to see that what you do is of value. And whatever you do, I work with women in cooperatives from villages who are part and parcel of what we do. And with whatever we do, we make sure that they are aligned to the production process and the value chain and link with the successes of the outcomes in terms of the clients and the customers, and can touch that. And it's very, very important that people are not just used as a market informal traders there, that they actually understand and appreciate they're part of this. But lastly, let me say as my closing remark, the intra-Africa trade, continental trade, is a very important thing for us. But what we need to do, I was very happy to hear the newly appointed General Secretary talking about ensuring that we include everybody. Cross-border trade is very big in terms of women and those in the clothing industry. And we need to make sure in whatever we do, we build on those indigenous experiences. But those who need this for survival, but can be catapulted into exporters themselves, because it is possible. This is our industry. We need to claim it, and we need to own it, and we need to be assisted to proudly present what Africa can show the world creatively.
Very well said. Thank you, Dr. Vuyo. Gillian, your closing comments in about 2 minutes.
For me, I think I would echo Dr. Vuyo's point about the importance of Africa free trade. And I would say the big thing we need to focus on is cooperation. In this cooperation as public sector leaders, as someone has mentioned on the comment, also cooperation as industry. So AFI is playing such a great role here in terms of creating a market for African fabrics for Africa, right? And that means unlocking infrastructural barriers, unlocking consumer demand, unlocking consumer price points, and even down to things like making sure that the PPE we produce actually gets into the right hands of our ministries of health. So I think industry and public sector need to cooperate with each other and across borders in order to make this a truly long-term and viable market for all of us.
Thank you, Gillian. Kelvyn, your closing remarks?
Yeah, I think I'd like to summarize maybe by saying that the adversity that we're facing within the COVID-19, there are negatives, but certainly we need to hold on to the opportunities, take the opportunity to try and sell to clients and customers that have had a single source supply, and build on the African focus, the locally made. The creation of a brand is probably the most important thing for all of us. If we have a strong brand that has connection to Africa, brand that has connection to local source, those are the items, or those are the products, the holding items that consumer are going to look at going forward. You know, that it's free trade, that it's good for the environment, that it's local. All those things are going to add to the value of your product. So start with that brand and have good connotations to those good local base items, and I'm sure that you'll be successful.
Thank you, Kelvyn. Nicole, your closing remarks.
Thank you. It's a bit difficult to come with a closing comment once everybody has summarized this all so succinctly. But the one thing that I just want to leave with everyone is that for this trade agreement to be a success, and for Africa to be the success that it is, it has to be a collaborative effort. It requires the efforts, combined efforts of government policymakers, retailers, manufacturers, consumers, down to every single one of us listening in on this webinar, we all play a critical role in ensuring the success of the trade agreement. We all have to act responsibly. We've got to act within the ambit of our conscience to ensure that we're making the right choices. And the responsibility also lies quite squarely on government agencies, that we also put in place the correct policies and have the correct decision makers to ensure that the spirit of the free trade agreement is not lost. Because fundamentally, that is all that we're trying to achieve, is a collaborative, cohesive Africa trading partnership that would benefit many sectors, but I think our textile sector stands to benefit the most.
Thank you very much, Nicole. We're now about at the time where I'll make a few closing remarks on my end and try to pull the key highlights. And there are quite a few questions that have come for Dr. Precious. So I will leave her a little bit more time than was planned so that she can also close with her experience and her perspective. The highlights for me from this excellent panel that we've had today, starting first with values and demand to drive African tastes and brands. So if we start with that, the aspirational side, I think, was the way it was phrased by Dr. Vuyo. We could then drive the transformation, because then the customer demands will be well known. And once those are known, as Gillian said, investors will come. So the investment side of the story, we didn't talk much about it, because I think it seems that it should be something that there'll be a lot of willingness to do. And I've noticed even today, when you look at the manufacturing of masks that's taking place locally, a number of investors have already come in to try to support that. The second big item that has come up in our conversation is that if we use the fashion industry as a driver, it could actually drive the entire value chain. So this is a very important element to bring in, and that would require us to brand and blend the informal and formal sector, which is where a lot of the innovation creativity is in, but then also blend it with technology and infrastructure inputs that would allow us to go to scale. So I see that link came out very strongly between aspiration, creativity, and design. Then the other one that is very important is that to produce locally, regardless of where we are, including the question that came from Mozambique, you have to start small. Do something you can specialize in, do it small, but then scale up from there. So the opportunities exist if we can define well our starting points and our possibility to scale. And then a big point that was also made was on resilience, that Africa is able to jump into these sectors quite quickly because it has been tested in different ways. It is resilient and therefore can bring in some of those capabilities to address emerging risks and then use them to piggyback going forward. But then we have a number of opportunities that we can tap into. The Continental Free Trade Area gives us an opportunity to do that. However, we didn't have much time to discuss it. We need to work on the legislative agenda to make sure that countries are preparing that groundwork as well so that they can benefit from this open trading possibility, and that everyone needs to work together, policymakers, consumers, producers, and everyone else in the chain. And then the last comment, and I think this one I will use to close with, where the infrastructure is and where the opportunities for supply chain are, we already see major movement. You look at Ethiopia with electricity and with the Ethiopian Airlines cargo, and that moves very well. Same thing can be said about Rwanda and South Africa that have those inputs already in place. And Kenya is coming up also very quickly into that space, as is Cote d'Ivoire. So with those closing remarks, I think it's been a very exciting morning. I feel very energized to go forward. And I want to give Dr. Precious more time for her closing remarks, given some of the questions directed exactly to her. Dr. Precious?
Thank you very much, Frannie. Dr. Frannie Leautier is the Senior partner at SouthBridge Group. And as I said earlier, I've known her from the wonderful work that she does at the World Economic Forum. And I really thank you for waking up at early hours in Washington, DC, where you currently are, to facilitate our panel. And thanks for the summary that you provided at the end of the discussions. I want to thank all our panelists for this very, very insightful, very exciting discussion that we've had today. Kelvyn, thank you very much for highlighting that our designers have innovated. As I said to you earlier, my grandmother wore sishweshwe, and it's still a fabric that is very commonly used. Nicole, thank you very much for your remarks as well. You know, I attend and I'm part of the annual Copenhagen Fashion Summit, where we discuss issues around sustainability. And I'm so glad that you highlighted the dumping that happens on the continent. And we need to start, you know, getting ourselves sorted out as far as sustainability on the continent is concerned, from how we produce our fabrics to how we treat our laborers as well. I want to thank Gillian also for, you gave us a very beautiful spin on the PPE supply and demand, and I really hope that Nicole, you know, from the IDC, DTI side, you will take this forward. We don't need to be waiting for anybody to manufacture these PPEs for us. Surgical gowns, hospital gowns are, you know, products that our CMTs, our designers are able to manufacture. Our engineers are busy making ventilators for us. So the industry needs to really step in and step up. And Vuyo, congratulations on your brand, and thank you very much for highlighting how locally, as well as I think it was Nicole who spoke about Ethiopia, locally we're producing the cotton, the mohair that you know that ends up in our clothing. The Eastern Cape has produced the likes of Laduma. You have started a brand there, and we're very, very proud of the work that you do. And to all our listeners, Frannie, I know you referred to some of the questions that have been sent. If we haven't been able to get to you through our panel, we promise to compile these Q&As and come back to you, you know, with answers from each of the panelists. I know the burning question has been that of finance. A lot of designers have said they do not have access to the financing they need to build their businesses. This is actually a good time to be focusing on your business. There is not going to be a post-COVID era. This is the post-COVID era. We need to focus on working, knowing that the virus is going to be with us for a very long time. And what I'm confident about and what I'll leave you with is that I know that as Africans, we have overcome a lot of adversities, and we will come out of this you know, very well, and I'm confident that we will do it as a collaborative effort. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you to our panel and our facilitator, and we hope to see you again at another one of the AFI conversations.